Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests. My name is Csaba BÉKÉS. I'm the founding director of the Cold War History Research Center. And welcome to the 15th Annual Cold War History Research Center International Student Conference at Corvinus University of Budapest. Well, the center actually celebrated its 25th birthday last year because it was established in December 1998. But technically it was operating from January 1999, so it was a special occasion last year. Now we have a kind of other type of anniversary as well. This is the 15th International Student Conference organized by our center, which is also a nice number, I think, and we hope that this number could be even higher in the future. Well, my job is just to have a couple of comments about the conference and the center itself. But basically, I will use this for mentioning our most important collaborators, international collaborators in this project, because we have been having these conferences in collaboration with our international partners in very important places, you know. And for several years now. And of course, first of all, I would like to mention the names and the institutions which we have been collaborating with. Well, Victoria Phillips is the #1 person who has to be mentioned. Unfortunately, all the people I'm mentioning here as international partners could not come to the conference itself, although Victoria was here with the Cold War Archives Research Fellows for their research in the Open Society Archive, as you well know it, but unfortunately she had to go back to the United States in the meantime for family reasons. Of course, she is a very important person in organizing these conferences, because she is the one who is taking care of the Cold War Archive Fellows and their research and everything else. You know, she is the co-director of the Cold War Archives Research Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Also, formerly, she was teaching at the European Institute at Columbia University in New York. And also she was affiliated after that for several years with the London School of Economics and Political Science. You know. Well, our other partner is the Cold War International History Project, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And there our big collaborator and all-time friend, Christian Osterman must be mentioned, who is the director of the History and Public Policy Program, also the director of the Cold War Project as well at the Wilson Center. Also, he is also a co-director of the Cold War Archives Research Institute, which is the kind of umbrella organization for the research activities for the Cold War Archives Fellows, who we can also welcome here in a nice number again at this conference. And last but not least, our other international cooperating partner is the London School of Economics for several years now, and they're the head of the Cold War Studies program at the Department of International History must be mentioned, Vladislav Zubov, you know, who is a very well-known historian of the Soviet Union and the whole region as such. And of course, he is also a very important part of our collaboration. And like a couple of years ago, actually, he was the person who had the keynote speech for our conference at that time. And the good news is, after all this is definitely very good news that that we have all these collaborators, but the bad news was that they were not able to be with us in person. But then the good news is that we have a representative of the London School of Economics here in the person of Aaron Clift, who is an LSE fellow at the London School of Economics and at collaborating with the Cold War Studies program. And he was kind enough to accept our invitation, and he is here in person, and he will also chair panel 6 at this conference. And please, if you can stand up so that everybody can see you. Okay, so Aaron, will be with us for the whole duration of the conference. So if you have any questions or comments or whatever, problems concerning LSE, now it's the right time for you to ask the question.
By all means, ask me anything.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And with this, after introducing our international partners, so let me just give the floor to the department, the head of our institute, which actually director of the Institute of Global Studies at Corvinus University, Ágnes SZUNOMÁR, and she will have the official opening speech for the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have two very pleasing duties now. First is to praise a bit the research center, so to share a few information on what has happened in the past more than a quarter of a century, and then to introduce the keynote speaker as well. So let me start with praising the research center, which has been, as it has already been mentioned, established long ago in 1998, that time as an NGO, but later on, once Professor BÉKÉS joined Corvinus University, it became an inherent part of the university itself. Our institute, the Institute of Global Studies, has been established 4 years ago, and ever since the center works under the umbrella of this institution, which otherwise composed of two departments, the Department of International Relations and the Department of World Economy, so two quite fitting, if you like, disciplines. The main output of the research center is an English language content providing website, thecoldwar.hu. Hopefully many of you are well aware, since international scholars as well as students interested in the Cold War, in the Soviet bloc, East-West relations, communism are usually very aware of this website and the very precious content it has. But besides that, the research center has two main publications, two unique series, if you like. The first one is a 5-part extensive chronology, the history of the Soviet bloc, and the other one is a bibliography of new Cold War history, which lists basically all the books and the articles that are related with the Cold War, published since 1989, anywhere in the world in any language with English transcriptions. The center also has an internship program which started in 2009, and so far more than 350 students from all over the world joined this internship program, which means a pretty big outreach. In the current academic year we have 30 interns, 26 of that are Corvinus students, but the rest are coming from different type of other countries. Since 2017, the center has a partnership with the Oxford University, which means that 3 to 5 students arrive from Oxford for a summer internship to Budapest. And for this summer university, there is a record number of applications, almost 30 applicants for the 3 available positions, which again indicates the growing popularity of this internship. Since 2010, we organize this annual 2-day English Language International Student Conference with the participation of BA, MA and PhD students. And the previous conferences, 14 previous conferences, were very successful. Almost 350 students attended from all over the world. I have some numbers here, so from 26 countries representing 54 universities, which is quite a big number. So all this is a proof of the excellent academic activity conducted in this research center. And with any further ado, let me just go on with presenting our keynote speaker, who happens to sit next to me, Professor BÉKÉS, the founding father of this research institute, but also professor of history at this very university, and a research professor emeritus in the Center for Social Sciences, Institute for Political Science. Professor BÉKÉS was the István Deák visiting professor for East Central European History at Columbia University in 2007, 2010, 11, 15 and 16, as well as a Fulbright visiting professor at the New York University between 2006 and 7. He has been a member of the International Editorial Board of 2 journals, the Journal of Cold War Studies of Harvard University and the Advisory Board of the Cold War History of the London School of Economics. He's also a contributor to 3 volumes of the Cambridge history of the Cold War, and he has many books, including the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, A History in Documents, and the Soviet occupation of Romania, Hungary, and Austria. And his speech today will be based on his other recent book, Hungary's Cold War, which I can see there, International Relations from the End of the Second World War to the Fall of the Soviet Union, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in the US, and prestigious The New Cold War History series in 2022. The title of his keynote speech is The Soviet Bloc in the Cold War. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm just wondering whether you can stay for this.
I can stay a bit. I will sit there.
Okay, and then you have to leave because
After
unfortunately,
a moment, I have to leave.
management leaders are very busy, as we know.
They have to manage stuff.
Yes, they have to manage after this. Okay. So thank you very much. I have already showed this book, and what I usually do in classroom as well, I pass it over to the students. So that's what I'm doing. So Barnabas, please just give it over to the participants, and then just have a look. You don't have to read it here on the spot, right? Just pass it over after a couple of minutes, and then everybody can have a look into the book. So that you have a physical experience with the book. Otherwise, hopefully, you have heard about that, and also it's available in the international book market already. So with this, my keynote speech will be around like 40 minutes, and then we plan to have a 10-15 minutes Q&A after that. So you can ask questions or make comments concerning the content of this speech. Let me just switch it off so that we are sure there is no incoming call in the meantime. Yeah.
There is.
No, it's something else. This machine did some sound. I don't know what. Anyhow. So, with this, basically this book is a kind of synthesis of my 30 years of research and findings. So it's really a kind of synthesizing, scholarly work. And of course, I'm not trying to tell you the content of this book in this relatively short keynote speech. However, what I'm trying to focus on is presenting a number of theoretical innovations and novel interpretations, discoveries I have made in the field of the history and theory of international relations and Cold War history. So I'm just going one by one. I'm following it chronologically. So I will start at the beginning of the Cold War, or at the end of the Second World War, basically. And then we will reach, by the end, we will reach the end of the Cold War period in 1991. But of course, these are individual items. These are like thesis-like presentations. So I'm not going into big details about any of them. But whenever the thesis needs some kind of explanation, I'm trying to do it in a concise way. But of course, please don't expect a very detailed, very sophisticated outline of every and each issue. If one of them or any of them is of greater interest, of course, that's why we have the Q&A. So you can then come in and say, okay, so but what about that? It was interesting. So what can you add to that topic? Besides what you have already said. So. Let me just start with the date, which is actually just before the end of the Second World War, and that is the very famous, or even infamous, percentage agreement between Churchill and Stalin in 1944, in October 1944, when Churchill visited Stalin in Moscow, and they had a kind of conversation, and according to the kind of more mainstream literature, kind of deal. They made a deal about East Central Europe, dividing the region by countries and by numbers of percentages about what kind of influence the Soviet Union or the Western great powers would or should have about that particular country. So it was made by country. And it's available in the British archives, and it's an existing one, so it's not a legend, so it's a real one. However, the problem is that it's a very long-time debated issue, and it's about the significance of this deal, whether this deal actually really had any important outcome in the later stages of the emerging Cold War, or in the relationship between East and West and the Soviet Union and the Western great powers, or not. And my very strong statement here is that this was basically a game, a game, because most scholars actually take it too seriously. That's my point. And what I try to explain and draw attention to is that there is only one serious part of that deal and one serious country about which the deal was real, and that was Greece. All the other countries in East Central Europe didn't count in this deal. Whatever numbers they were talking about, and even changing the numbers, whatever, it was not real because it did not have any importance at that time. We shouldn't forget that by the time October 1944, much of Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, was already occupied by the Soviet army. And of course, there was no question that this would actually continue exactly like that. So basically, to talk about any real significant influence for the Western powers under such conditions, was an illusion. Because it was a done deal by that time. It was absolutely a done deal by that time, especially that the fate of the region was decided not at this moment, not in Yalta in February 1945, but already in Tehran in November, December 1943, a year earlier, by agreeing to the fact that the Second Front should be opened in Normandy and not somewhere close to East Central Europe. And that was on the demand of Stalin, because Stalin wanted to liberate and occupy East Central Europe, and that's actually what they agreed on, but not later, but already in Tehran. But it's a long story again, so that's why I'm saying that when it came to the percentage agreement, it was about Greece, because what Churchill wanted to achieve, to make Greece remaining in the Western sphere of influence, especially British sphere of influence. And then that's what happened, actually. So it was a deal between Stalin and Churchill on that particular issue, that the Soviet Union should not try to be a liberator of Greece as well, because they were very close. From Bulgaria, they could very easily move into Greece and at least partially liberate Greece, and then this would have been a different kind of geopolitical situation. Then the deal was made, and the deal was basically about that. We take Greece, and you take all the others. And that was a very good deal for Stalin, and that was no wonder he was basically very glad to agree to any kind of numbers, because he also knew that the numbers are not real. Okay? No wonder all these numbers and all these issues actually never came up in Yalta, in Potsdam, in any other international high-level communications at later stages. Well, when investigating Stalin's expansionist plans, which is a very important topic for Cold War research, early Cold War period research, I argue that these expansionist plans actually were trying to seize a never returning opportunity. So in Stalin's mind, the situation was so fluid after the Second World War that he wanted to try whatever could be tried. He knew that parts of these endeavors will be successful and parts of will be not successful. And he didn't care, because he said, whatever I already have, that would be fine. And what was that? Something? And that was East Central Europe. So Stalin already had East Central Europe, by the end of the Second World War, and that he was absolutely satisfied with that. However, this also was recognized by the Western great powers, but tacitly, not publicly, but tacitly, and Stalin was happy about that. However, he still was pushy in a certain way, and that was the problem, because the Western powers actually would have been expecting Stalin to be satisfied and then be calm and not trying to push for anything else. But Stalin did push for many other things which we know, the Turkish Straits and occupation of Japan, that is being part of the occupational regime in Japan as well, and many endeavors, plans which Stalin was pushing for, but then eventually he gave up these plans. So that's what I'm trying to draw attention to, that this was not, these parts, the second parts were not serious. The serious thing was East Central Europe, but he got it actually automatically, basically, so he didn't have to fight for that. But he still tried to get some more, because he said, if you can get some more, that's fine. That's a great game. If you don't get it, that's fine also. We tried, and that's not a problem, because we have what we actually really need. So here the problem is the problem of perception and misperception in the history of the Cold War, which already is demonstrated very well in this case. All these endeavors, trials on the side of Stalin, as I said, were not serious. However, the Western great powers did see them, did regard them as serious, aggressive, pushy, excessive demands on the side of the Soviet Union. Okay, and that is already something which actually very much contributed to the emerging Cold War, losing confidence with each other. So that was the main part of the story for both sides, and definitely this was very much a factor by which Stalin was more and more seen on the Western side as a non-reliable political actor who actually is not satisfied with anything and wants to get more and more because he's only occupied with his own security problems and is not looking at others, which was basically, as I said, not the case, because when it came to any kind of real friction between East and West, then they retreated. They gave up these demands, and then nothing happened there. But they tried. Well, the Sovietization of East Central Europe is something which is an important topic. Again, even today, it's a debated issue. It was a very long time ago, and still there are very different opinions by scholars, serious scholars, about what the Sovietization was about and when it started, and what the content of this was. There are these two schools. I'm not going into that, of the traditionalists and revisionists, with different opinions, very conflicting different opinions about that. But first of all, my research definitely shows and demonstrates that this Sovietization process started already in 1944. When the Soviet army was liberating these countries of East Central Europe. Also, it was a very sophisticated project on the side of Stalin, and this was also a gradual Sovietization. It didn't happen overnight. Like, actually, there was a model for that. That was the Baltic states. The Baltic states were re-Sovietized in 1944-45. Again, they were already Sovietized once in 1940 when they were captured by the Soviet Union. But now it was done again in a very short period of time. Here, actually, in East Central Europe, this whole process took several years, from 1944 up until 1948. And we will also see why. But on the basis of this research, I made a new categorization of the two groups of the region, and one was the group of quasi-Sovietized countries who were basically already Sovietized, but it still didn't look like fully Sovietized, but technically it was already absolutely ready for full transformation. And these were Albania, Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Okay, and there were two other countries which were not yet fully, or in that sense, quasi-Sovietized yet, because the situation was more fluid in those countries, and that was Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And for them, I introduced the term pre-Sovietized countries, because they were already in a stage when basically everything was going right for the communists to do the same thing as in the other countries, but the result of the level of Sovietization and the process was not yet as high as in the other countries. So they needed more work to do in this respect. Well, I also introduced this idea that this gradual Sovietization, it was because, as I said, it could have been done in a different way as well. They could have followed the model of the Baltic states, just Sovietize these countries overnight, and nothing would have happened. Okay, I mean, really, nothing would be impossible for the Soviets to do this, but they didn't want to do this on purpose. And why? So I explained that the gradual Sovietization of the region was a tacit gesture of Stalin to the Western great powers, and especially to the United States. Why? Because Stalin wanted to keep up cooperation with the Western powers for as long as possible after the war. And why? Because Stalin needed economic help from the United States. Actually, he wanted and he was pushing for such economic help. We know it from all kinds of sources. And up until the summer of 1947, up until the Marshall Plan, the idea of Stalin was that it is doable. Sooner or later, actually, they can get a kind of VIP type economic help, support, aid from the United States for the reconstruction, rebuilding of the Soviet Union, which was hugely devastated. Eventually it failed, it never came, but Stalin up until that time was hoping that something actually can be done, and because of that he wanted to keep good relations with the Western powers. And of course the Sovietization of Eastern Europe was also part of this deal, because by this it was easier for the United States to also keep up good relations with the Soviet Union. With the overnight Sovietization, like in the Baltic states, this would have been much harder for the United States to do, because then the communists and Stalin and the Soviet Union would have been unmasked as an aggressor, as a very excessive power, like grabbing the territory and then like communizing it right away. So that would have been very bad PR work, right? So here the gesture was about this, that Stalin actually let it happen in a gradual way, because he knew that the end result will be the same anyhow. So he didn't lose anything because he had this territory under his dominance anyhow. So it meant that the kind of deal was about the Sovietization process would start in East Central Europe once they were occupied, but this whole process would look as democratic as possible, but only look as democratic as possible. But again, it's a long story, and I have no time to go into this in detail. Also about Sovietization, I also introduced this category of the Sovietization actually was the stealthy revolution. The stealthy revolution, because it was kind of concealed. It didn't happen in a really revolutionary way. It happened in a very camouflaged way, so that actually everything was moving into that direction. But from the outside, it looked like not so dangerous yet. Because it was like done in a very sophisticated way. Again, I have no time for going into that detail. But of course, in the book itself, I dedicate a whole chapter for the details and the maneuvers of the Sovietization and the kind of like very detailed analysis of what kind of means the Soviet-backed communist parties in East Central Europe used to build up their political power in those countries. Already in this early period. Also, there were all kinds of speculations about a kind of blueprint of the communist takeover. Especially the revisionist school is bringing up the argument that there is no such blueprint, because how to communize East Central Europe, because nothing came out of the archives. Okay, nobody could actually produce anything like that. But actually, I found one. And that is a kind of a speech of Rákosi, Mátyás Rákosi, the Hungarian communist leader, who actually made a speech in May 1946 at the Central Committee meeting of the Hungarian Communist Party, in which he actually made a huge speech about the maneuvers and the technology and the whole procedure, how the Communist Party should maneuver among the other coalition parties and how they should actually intervene in their internal affairs and how they should undermine their internal coherence and many other things. And that's actually related by Rákosi at really great length and great detail. So actually we can use that speech as a kind of blueprint for the Static Revolution, which is otherwise really not existing as a actually small booklet or anything like that. You know, we didn't find anything. But that speech is definitely such a thing. You know, and also this was not just Rákosi's own idea, because Rákosi met Stalin in April 1946, and the most important message what Stalin gave to Rákosi at the time, that it was now time to speed up the Sovietization process, okay, and prepare for a future takeover. So this is more than 1 year before the Marshall Plan. Okay, so that's a very important finding also. And by the way, this whole speech, which is a very long speech, is now being published in English as well. We published a book about it, which was mentioned, occupation of Hungary, Romania, and Austria in 2015 by the Central European University Press at the time. And the whole speech is verbatim published in that book, so you can actually check the content if you are interested in that particular procedure. Also, from the Stalin meeting, we have the information about that already in the spring of 1946, there was a plan to establish the new communist organization, that is the Cominform. Earlier, it was regarded as a kind of improvisation, as a kind of reaction to the Marshall Plan of 1947 in the summer, and then in September the Cominform was really established. But we didn't know about that. The plan, the actual plan for the establishment of this new Information Bureau of Communist and Workers' Parties was already in place in April 1946. Also, the Marshall Plan is a very debated issue even today. And thus, I introduced a new interpretation for the Marshall Plan, saying that the Marshall Plan was a double trap for both the Soviet Union and the United States. That it was a trap for the Soviet Union, it's more or less kind of common understanding now, although not many scholars call it in this way, but it was no question that for Stalin it was really a big trap by which he only could lose. But why was it a trap for the Americans, for the United States? Well, it was a trap for the United States because they had a big challenge, and the big challenge was about that when they offered this economic help, this aid to all of the countries of Europe, including the Soviet Union and the East Central European countries as well, already under Soviet domination at the time, then they had to cheat. We can also say lie. Why? Because actually they didn't mean it, you know. So they promised it, but they knew that those countries would never be able to take it, and especially the Soviet Union, of course, but also all the others as well, because of the Soviet dominance either also. So, but if they had chosen to be frank and say, okay, this money is just for Western Europe, you know, as it was the case, you know, they wanted to save Western Europe from Soviet political influence, you know, and that was a right cause. That was absolutely necessary. So we can say that was a good decision in itself. You know. But problem was the presentation. The presentation was a kind of how to say, deception because they didn't mean it for the eastern part of Europe. Because if they had been frank, then actually the division of Europe would have been the responsibility of the United States. You know? And they wanted to seem to be the good guys, not the bad guys. You know? Now, after the Marshall Plan and the establishment of the Cominform, the bad guys became the Soviets, because they took the responsibility for dividing Europe by establishing their own official Soviet bloc by the Cominform. And also because they had also to somehow explain it, why all this is necessary, why we cannot accept the the Marshall Plan, and then they introduced these very infamous thesis of the Stalin doctrine, that is that the world is now divided into two hostile camps, the peace camp led by the Soviet Union and the imperialist camp longing for a new war that is led by the United States. And of course, this was a huge rupture compared to the previous situation when the allies were still allies on paper until that time. But with this new ideology introduced, of course, this was already the thing of the past. So that definitely very seriously contributed to the outcome of the future processes of the emergence of the Cold War. Just one very short remark about the Red Army. The Red Army is being used in international literature in a wrong way, by 95% of the authors even today, because the Red Army didn't exist during the Cold War, basically. It was renamed in February 1946, and the new name was Soviet Army. So after that, we should use the name Soviet Army. And then look into all kinds of books about the Cold War and anything else. You will find 95% the Red Army doing this and that. In 56, in 68, Czechoslovakia, even in 91, they are withdrawing. The Red Army is withdrawing from Eastern Europe, while they didn't exist already for many decades at that time. Well, that's not a really crucial thing, but it's really funny to see that somehow this was overlooked. It was not a secret decision. It was absolutely public knowledge at the time. Just scholars didn't pay attention to it. So I discovered this myself. Actually, I made the mistake myself many years ago, because when I started my career, I used Red Army all the time in the same way. But one day I just woke up and said, okay, here's the information. They didn't exist. So it will take some more time until our scholars internationally will accept it, but hopefully this day will come soon. I developed also a new conception for détente. But détente is also, again, a kind of a very special issue, and détente is something which a lot of people write about, and most of the people writing about actually mean a different thing. Or something very vague about what détente actually was. So in my interpretation, I'm not going into big details because actually it would need a long elaboration. It's not a kind of a period, how it is now presented in international literature, in mainstream literature today, that the kind of period between 69 and let's say 79 or something like that, when there was a relatively good relationship between the superpowers. Now it's not a period, it's not a couple of years or something like that, but it's a kind of a new model of superpower coexistence and East-West compared coexistence, which I introduced for this category. It was a compared coexistence, not peaceful. Peaceful coexistence was a Soviet term, which was peaceful in Europe, but it was absolutely not peaceful outside of Europe. So compared coexistence is something which really tells the nature of this issue. It was a compared coexistence because they had to coexist, they had to work together, they had to cooperate. That is the two giant superpowers to save the world from nuclear Armageddon. So to say, it's very very simple. And so this means that in my interpretation, détente was this new model which we started in 1953 and existed until 1991, the end of the Cold War. And it was working together and coexisted, so to say, with the Cold War structure. The Cold War structure never changed from 1945 to 1991. The kind of contradiction between the two sides, it was always there. Okay? But how to deal with each other, how to try to cooperate and survive, this was this kind of new model which I'm talking about. And it didn't come in the 60s or 70s or later. No, it came in 1953. And not because Stalin died, very important, but because of the hydrogen bomb. Okay? Because the hydrogen bomb changed everything. The whole perception of how a war could be waged. A third world war could have been waged until then in the minds of strategists, even with the use of atomic bombs, and then still such a war could have been won by one side. Now the idea became very the opposite. MAD emerged actually in the mid-1950s, not the 60s, with the idea that okay, if there is a thermonuclear war, everything is over and everybody is dead, and there's no winner. So that's the most important change, and that's why I say this data model actually functioned in the 50s, and then up until already in the 50s and up until the end of the 1980s. Also, new categorization was introduced by me about the international conflicts that occurred during the Cold War, and I'm differentiating real crisis from pseudo crisis. So the two categories are real crisis and pseudo crisis. The real crises are crises when there was really a big stake, and the interest of the two sides, the two superpowers, were at risk. So somebody wanted to change the status quo, let's say, in Berlin crisis, the Second Berlin crisis, or the Cuban Missile Crisis, obvious examples, and there were many others, of course. And then the other side also had to react to that, and then finally they had to find a kind of peaceful solution to the crisis. But those were really serious crises in that sense. The pseudo crisis looked like a big crisis for the international public, but they were not crisis situations for the policymakers, because they knew the limits of their power and they knew the existing European status quo policy. So let's say all the internal crises, even revolutions of the Soviet bloc, belong to the pseudo crisis category, which did not cause any real clash of interest between East and West. Okay? Even though, of course, the Western politicians always said they did. Of course, because they had to feed their own people and their own societies and own public opinion. They just couldn't be so cynical to say, well, we cannot do anything. We have this deal with the Soviets about European status quo, and that's it. So it was not really very nice for a politician who wanted to be re-elected, okay? Because in the Western countries, that was this habit of re-election. Well, this didn't exist in the Soviet bloc. So that was something which is the basis of this categorization. And also, just one addition, the Suez Crisis, which was not an internal Soviet bloc crisis, but it was an internal crisis of the Western bloc, that is British Americans and British and French on the one side and Americans on the other side were fighting actually behind the scenes. Okay, so that's a special. That was also a not East-West crisis in that sense. There was no real clash of interest between the Soviet Union and the United States or the Western camp. Also, I rediscovered the doctrine of the policy of active foreign policy, which was announced in 1954 by the Soviets, and it was meant to increase the fitness of the Soviet bloc states for international society and the maneuvering capability of the entire Soviet bloc. So they were now urging these countries to be more proactive in international forums and make initiatives and many other things from this time on. And this became a model for the 60s, 70s, 80s, and that's how the Soviets were working together with the Soviet bloc countries. Actually, not all the initiatives had to come from the Soviet Union from this time on, as was the case in the 1960s, 70s as well. But then, of course, the whole Soviet bloc was supporting such initiatives, one or the other individual countries. Also, I developed the concept of the emancipation of the Soviet bloc states. But from the mid-50s on, actually, there was a process of the emancipation of these countries, which meant that their position became much more partnership-like with the Soviet Union and with other countries of the world as well from this time on, especially emerging in the 1960s, 70s, and the 1980s. But the direction of this emancipation process was three directions. First of all, in the relationship with the Soviet Union, so they actually were upgraded from satellites to basically kind of partners, allies, by the 1960s. That was number one. The Western countries, because they were more and more, especially in the 1960s, were accepted as international partners for international negotiations without any big problem. Although back in the 1950s, they were regarded mere puppets of the Soviets. And now in the 60s, it really changed remarkably. And the number three direction was the third world, developing countries. which also regarded these countries more and more as partners, not just the puppets of the Soviet Union, but actually partners with which they could make special deals themselves. Also, altogether, from all this, I derived that a kind of theory which says that the role of the non-Soviet states of the Eastern Bloc, that is all the countries in this region, eventually played a much greater and significant role in shaping the overall policies of the Warsaw Pact, that is Soviet Bloc, that what is presented in mainstream literature even today. But again, that's a huge topic, but that's a very important new finding. And actually, it's a kind of basis for a new, relatively small but energetic new school of research, which is actually proving this, by case studies and archivist research in different countries' archives during the Cold War period. Also, I rediscovered an important and forgotten doctrinal change that seriously affected the worldview of the Soviet Bloc leaders. The introduction of the two zones theory in 1956. So until then, they had the Zhdanov doctrine, the two camps, and now these two zones was much more flexible. It was much more liberal in that sense. This new theory divided the world into two parts. One belonged to the imperialist bloc under the leadership of the United States, and NATO members, and all members of the US-led alliance, where the US had some kind of official alliance. But the other, much bigger part of the world was now called the peace zone. So the peace zone became actually a huge one, embracing not only the socialist countries, but every country in the world pursuing an anti-imperialist policy. So this was in Asia, Africa, everywhere. This was a fundamental change in the Soviet Bloc's policy of alliance. And now the slogan was, "Who is not against us is with us." So that was the slogan. This was the rule from this time on up until the end of the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact was established as the military organization, political military organization of the Soviet Bloc in 1955, and this is seen even today in mainstream literature as a kind of organization to discipline the Soviet Bloc countries, and to control them even more than before. My position is exactly the opposite. This was actually a situation whereby these countries gain more than what the Soviet Union gained at that time, because the multilateralization of the policy making in the Soviet Bloc started at that time, and now they had an organization for that. By the way, in which organization, on paper, they were equal with the Soviet Union. Of course, never in reality, but this was a great change from the previous times of Stalin. Well, in connection with the Hungarian Revolution, I introduced several new items and theses and theories. I'm not going into many of them because the time is passing, and we are still far from 1991. So let's skip most of the 1956 part, but everything is available in the book, of course, in great detail. Here, just one thing is something which is definitely important from a theoretical point of view, and that is the Mikoyan doctrine. The Mikoyan doctrine, Mikoyan made a decision or made a proposal at the time when the Soviets had to decide on whether to intervene in Hungary on the 23rd of October when the Hungarian Revolution was unfolding or not. And Mikoyan said not, he was the only person in the leadership said no. Why? Because we can actually solve it otherwise. How otherwise? Otherwise means by local means. Okay, by the local political and military forces, they should be able to do this. And if it doesn't work, then we can introduce our troops into Hungary. He was voted down. Actually, there was a vote, very rare thing in the Soviet leadership. And then he was voted down, and they intervened. And by this, actually, they ignited the revolution and the freedom fight, which was unfolding in Hungary. But from this action of Mikoyan, I derived the Mikoyan doctrine. So the Mikoyan doctrine didn't exist during the Cold War times. It's a kind of artificial doctrine, so it was not a doctrine used by them. And Brezhnev and the other leaders of the Soviet Union were using the Mikoyan doctrine, unknown, not knowing that they are using the Mikoyan doctrine because they didn't know about me. I was very small at that time, and I haven't yet developed the Mikoyan doctrine. But they still did it, okay? So because what is the but that after that, after 1956, in 1956 they didn't listen to me, but after in 68 in Czechoslovakia, in 80, 81 in Poland, you know, and also in Afghanistan, actually the Soviets were using this very patient policy, saying that trying to restore order by local means, and if it doesn't work, then we have to move in, and that sometimes they did, mostly, but in Poland, actually in 1981, they did not. You know, okay? So that's maybe the most important innovation concerning the Hungarian Revolution, and also there are several others, but again I'm not talking about them, but something what came later. Let's say the German question again is something which is very important, and European security became core problems of international relations in the 1960s. You know, already in the 50s as well, but not so much as in the 60s. You know, it came up. Why? Because there was no German peace treaty. It's so simple. Okay. And the borders of Poland were unsafe. They were not guaranteed, okay, under such conditions, and several other borders as well, but especially the German border was the other line, was the big problem. In general, the borders established in 1945 were not recognized basically by the western part, not just West Germany, but the western parts either. So this was the kind of fight, the period when the Soviet bloc was fighting for legalizing the borders of 1945 by international means in an international forum. So they wanted to organize a big international conference on the security of Europe. And that's exactly what the Helsinki process was about, and what the Helsinki Final Act became the final result of this process. Everybody heard about that. You know. But here, what is important and interesting, the internal workings of the decision-making processes within the Soviet bloc are still basically unknown to the mainstream literature, so to say, because it was regarded that there is a united Soviet bloc and there is a united Western bloc, and they were negotiating with each other, and then they came to some conclusion at the end. You know. No, actually, the Soviet Union was Soviet bloc was extremely divided. And here, for the division, you know, to introduce what was the basis of the division, I introduced the category of two existing sub-blocks within the Soviet bloc. There was the economic-oriented sub-bloc, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the security-concerned sub-bloc, the GDR, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Okay, I'm not going into details. So for this second group, security was first. You know, they didn't want to make any kind of progress with the Western powers, especially West Germany, until the borders were safe. For them, cooperation was secondary. For the other group, economy-oriented, like Hungary as well, it was number one. You know, they didn't care about anything because they were not affected by the border problems. You know, and then this created a huge clash within the Soviet bloc. You know, their policy making and preparations for the Helsinki process all were affected heavily by this internal clash in the Soviet bloc, which was absolutely unknown to the outside world at the time. Another issue is also somehow connected to this. I introduced the category of virtual coalition, the virtual coalition in the field of analyzing alliance policy based on the functioning of the Soviet bloc. You know. And this was, again, that's a long story. It's about that there were a couple of countries which were acting together, they were voting together, and they were pushing for the same things together, but they never coordinated their policies, okay? Neither multilaterally, nor even bilaterally. Neither publicly, neither secretly, no. They didn't even really recognize that they are doing this kind of thing, that being in a virtual coalition, until I didn't create this category again. Now they would know that what they were doing, actually. But at that time, they just did it on instinctively, right? But it was functioning very well. And that also has a lot of like very interesting outcomes, like just one crucial example could be mentioned, like Hungary and Romania were bilaterally having very bad relations, you know, during the Cold War, especially 60s, 70s. But on the international stage, within the Soviet bloc decision making, they were actually working in a very well in a virtual coalition together for their own joint interest, because they had the same interest, which was usually opening to the Western countries. and that's something which is very remarkable. And then in the case of the Prague Spring in 1968, again I very much against the socialism with a human face theory, which is very widespread even today, and I presented my my theory about that the processes would have led to the restoration of parliamentary democracy without foreign intervention, as it eventually occurred in 1990 in Czechoslovakia without the threat of foreign intervention. So it's a long story, but this is a very robust idea, because in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, and internationally as well, there are a lot of people who still want to believe in the myth of socialism with a human face, saying that no, there was no danger of counter-revolution. So the Soviets actually crushed something which was not dangerous to them. No, they crushed something which was dangerous for them. So that's my point. Also, the Second Cold War is as a category which is very widely used in mainstream literature as well. That is depicting the years between 1975 and 1985. And then here I introduced a kind of alternative option, saying that this is what we can call standby détente. So détente was not dead, détente was not over, détente was always there, according to my explanation, which I said earlier. It means that at the superpower level there were frictions and contradictions, and many, even on the propaganda level mostly, a kind of cooling of the relations. But actually the whole issue was not that serious at all at the level of realpolitik. And because of that, we can maybe call this kind of years of the like détente on standby. Again, I'm skipping there was an intra-bloc sub-crisis in the East-West relationship emerging after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in which the Eastern European countries became important actors, especially Hungary. I'm not telling this story, but it's in the book. So again, this was also a kind of victory for Hungarian foreign policy, because they could push the Soviets into the direction of cooperation, maintaining the results of Dayton, although the Soviets wanted to freeze these relations as a kind of punishment for the punishment of the United States for the boycott of the Olympics and things like that. So that was a very interesting thing and development at the time. Also, when analyzing East-West relations in the second half of the 1980s, Gorbachev's policy and Reagan's like negotiations of Gorbachev and Reagan actually brought some kind of a new idea as well, and then from this perspective, I made a claim that the cooperative attitude of Gorbachev towards the West in the second half of the 1980s, which was developing in a very liberal and very kind of positive direction, gradually, this was very much affected by the Ronald Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative. Again, a very debated issue also, but in this case I argue that this was really having a great impact on Soviet policy. So it was a good kind of thing to do by Reagan, who otherwise in the United States itself is either loved by people or hated. Okay, so again, it's a big problem. I don't look even at Reagan from this perspective. He's an actor in international politics, and when he's doing something wrong, I say, that's a very bad thing. When he's doing something good, I say, wow, great, go on. So here he did a great thing with this, and actually he contributed to the peaceful ending of the Cold War by this definite sticking to SDI, because he didn't want to give up SDI. That was the big point. Gorbachev was begging, give up SDI, and then we can agree on anything. And Reagan said, we can agree on anything, but I don't give up SDI. So it had to be Gorbachev who had to yield eventually. Okay? And then finally, there is a very important turning point in the history of the Soviet bloc in July 1988. So that is the turning point for the Soviet bloc, where because even in the history of the Cold War, this was a huge meeting of the Warsaw Pact Consultative Committee in July 1988 in Warsaw, where Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, openly admitted that the Soviet Union was facing critical situation and it could no longer afford to run a permanent arms race with the West, given that it exceeded the Eastern Bloc in every possible respect. So this was a kind of confession that we lost the Cold War, we lost the competition with the United States. So this can be considered as the beginning of the end for the Soviet bloc. Finally, I also tried to find an explanation why the Soviet Union, Soviet leadership with Gorbachev actually was so liberal to let East Central Europe go, because of scholars, of course, are looking for this answer for a long time now. And my interpretation is based on a newly introduced term, the Brest-Litovsk syndrome. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty happened in 1918, whereby the Soviets actually had to sacrifice huge territories to Germany at that time. And Lenin argued to do this, while Trotsky said no. Originally, that this is necessary because this is the only way we can save the imperial center, that is the Soviet state, the Soviet state, which was in actually mortal danger in a certain sense because of the civil war going on at the time. So and Gorbachev actually was facing the same dilemma because the Soviet Union was in that particularly bad shape already in 1988, but it was not known to the public, not known to the whole world, because even in the Soviet Union, perhaps very few people knew how bad the situation was in the Soviet Union economically. So that's something which is a new. And I think it was a life or death fight in 1918 as well, but also in 1988. So that's how I introduced this as the kind of background for our understanding why they decided to give up the periphery and focus on preserving the core. That is the center of Soviet power, which at that time still meant the Soviet Union as such altogether. They wanted to save it, and we know that even that was not possible eventually. But at that time, at least they were hoping that if they sacrifice the periphery, then they can save the center. And finally, also again, I'm not going into this. It's in the book. I introduced the theory of floating of the Brezhnev doctrine, but that was about that. All the participants should not be able to tell whether the Brezhnev doctrine was valid or not. Whether the Soviets would come and crush any kind of revolt or whatever in the Eastern European countries or not. And that was a very successful, floating, because really nobody knew it, until the very end. And this had a kind of like pacifying effect on the events of East Central Europe, and that's how actually the changes happened in such a relatively smooth way, except for Romania. And really, very finally, after during the political changes and after the political changes happened in East Central Europe, there is a very important theory which I actually developed already 20 years ago, or 25 technically, and published also in English and in French as well, so not just in Hungarian, but which now is being recognized by other scholars as well and reinvented, now they are realizing that yes, that was really the case. What is that? That Gorbachev only agreed to the internal transformation of the Soviet bloc countries. So they could go capitalist, democratic, everything, but the Soviet bloc as such and the Soviet sphere of influence should stay intact. The Warsaw Pact, the Comecon should stay in place. And that was not just Gorbachev's dream and wish, but actually the Western powers at the time, including the United States, wholeheartedly supported this project up until the spring of 1991. Okay? Again, this is important. Why? Because in the mainstream literature you read about exactly the opposite. People, former diplomats, politicians, everything else, or everybody else, would claim that from the time of kindergarten, I was dreaming of the freedom of the Eastern European countries already. And that's what they write in their memoirs and everything, because it cannot be checked, because the documents on the Western side are not yet available, mostly not available yet. On the Eastern side, these are available for many decades now. since 1989. So on the basis of those documents, we absolutely clearly can prove this, which is not a problem. That was fine. That they were trying to stabilize the situation. They were very much afraid of Gorbachev losing power. Okay, and that was understandable. And even retrospectively, as historians, we can agree with that, and that's fine. So, subordinating the interest of East Central Europe to the big cause of saving the Soviet Union as a kind of transforming country, which could be transformed into a civilized entity, with Gorbachev at the top, that was really a good project. The only thing is necessary that we should not forge history. And now when we can claim and we can prove that things that happened in a different way, so there was a transitory period when the Western powers were still doing that, supporting Gorbachev against the independence of the Eastern European countries, this should be just simply recognized. That's all I'm asking for. Thank you very much. And now I am... yeah, well, definitely we have not that very much time for Q&A, but of course, if there are questions, we could quickly handle them, and then we definitely, so we will have anyhow a break after this with coffee, so even together with coffee, this could be continued, but definitely, it's a formal Q&A as well, so if there are any questions about any of these topics or ideas, just feel free to speak up. Yeah.
Professor BÉKÉS, first of all, let me thank you for your introduction to this two-day-long conference. Thank you very much for your thoughts and for the excellent context which the lectures are supposed to be within or maybe outside. We don't know yet. I will touch upon the synthetical character of your works, if I may. First of all, I would like to praise your excellent synthesis, including the book that has been circulating here. I think you are one of the few scholars who could synthesize the Cold War period in a very, very plausible way. You know, as I do, and many of us do, that many syntheses have been written in the last decades. But to do it in a plausible way, in a way which could be believed, could be trusted, I think it's less available. And it also includes serious conflicts. I mean, you have introduced new terms, new periodization, and what I mean conflicts is that imagine somebody, a Hungarian historian, writing about 1956 in Hungary, saying that, well, the revolution was a conflict. Sure, it was a tragedy, no question, but it was a pseudo crisis as far as the international context is concerned. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. My question, if I may, also regards the synthetical character of synthesizing the Cold War. To what extent do you think recent international events we are happening to live in today, to what extent do you think could make an impact on the interpretation of the Cold War, if they can at all? To what extent they can influence in hindsight, backwards? I know it might be a little bit out of the box, but can you consider this question for me, please? Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the comment on the book, which is of course always good to hear that very knowledgeable scholars, from Slovakia. Barnabas Vajda is a long-time collaborator of this conference also, who is serving as a panel head for many years now, and also an excellent scholar of the Cold War period in this region. So definitely that's a great joy to hear. As for the question, it's a very tough question, but of course right away without making any preparations on this. I can just rely on my own conception whether this is what's happening today is somehow connected to the Cold War or not. Whether the similarities or the differences are bigger between the two international situations. And my general view up until now is that this is not a second Cold War. It's not a new Cold War. This is a very different kind of international situation, which is of course very difficult to analyze now because it's just happening. But going back to the original question about how all this would or could maybe change our views of the Cold War, I don't really think that very much should happen or would happen in this respect, because the Cold War is a closed period. The good news is about the Cold War in that sense, it was a long period, but now it's closed. And the other good news is that the sources of that period and that conflict, or the so-called bipolar world order, are becoming open more and more. So now more and more documents are available on both sides, on the eastern side as well, already from the early 1990s and later, and also on the western side. Now mostly the documents up until 91, the end of the Cold War, should be available, not everywhere, but more and more available. So then there are not that many remaining secrets or any kind of problems which we could think that, okay, once the archives would open, we could tell more about this and that. Now we should be able to tell basically the real position on the Cold War. And I think what can be done on the Cold War is to look for more synthesis. More synthesis like this one and others as well, because there are such research project going on by other people as well in the region. As I said, this kind of new, especially the countries of East Central Europe, in Poland, in Romania as well, in Bulgaria, in the former GDR territory as well. There's a huge emerging literature, and so I think whereby the focus of the present day mainstream literature could be changed is some kind of incoming of the novel and new interpretations stemming from the research of the East Central European countries, because this view, this kind of perspective was very much missing from the general Cold War history. Let's say up until 1989, it was non-existent. Okay, in the 90s, it started to be existing, but a little bit only, a little bit. And then the next decade again, something more was incorporated. But as general, topics, that is the experience of the East Central European countries is still very far from being integrated into general Cold War. So why? Because the multiplicity of languages. Most of the research is going on in the native languages, the publications as well. Some is published in English, which is good news. But the majority of the findings is available only in the native languages, and very few people have the capabilities like Mark Kramer, our joint friend, who actually could read almost all the languages of the region. He's at Harvard University, as you may know. And other than that, most people, suffer from the lack of the knowledge to read everything and to digest everything together. And this is not yet put together even on this side. So this is something the task of the future. And then when it's done, this should be somehow incorporated into the general mainstream literature, which is still dominated by Western scholars and Western literature and Western actors. But of course now it's much more international than it used to be.
You mentioned the impact of the East Central European research on the history of the Cold War. Also, it seems to be, and it has been, a kind of a competition, because since the end of the Cold War, for instance, the global perspective has appeared, and it's not only the East Central European perspective that has to be brought into, but also the global perspective. So in some way, it the interpretation changes by time, doesn't it?
Well, yes. Yeah, but that's something which will take time.
Right.
It take time. So at the moment, it's very difficult to say really more than that. So I think it's something which we will have to work on and think about all the time, and reinterpret and rethink our own theories as well. And this will be a kind of hard experience in a certain way as well. But it's I think it's the task of the future as well. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, if there are no more questions, actually we are already in the coffee break. If you haven't noticed that yet, I don't smell any coffee here, but outside they are promising the coffee. So thank you very much for your attention. And now we have a 20-minute coffee break.